There is a 22-story building in Manhattan that has been standing for 124 years on a piece of land that nobody else wanted, in a shape that critics said would not survive a single winter. It has appeared in more films than most working actors. It has been photographed more times than almost any building in America. It is one of only 2 buildings in this entire investigative file that I am about to tell you, with confidence, has never sunk and has never leaned. The other one is in San Francisco, and it cost $2 billion and was completed in 2018. This one was finished in 1902 for 1/10 the cost in real terms, by a Chicago architect named Daniel Burnham, who anchored it into Manhattan bedrock at a time when most developers did not bother. And yet, in March of 2023, a man named Jacob Garlick walked into a court, ordered public auction, bid $190 million to buy the building, won the auction, and then vanished without paying a single cent. He has never fully explained what happened. He has never been criminally charged. And the building he tried to buy is now being converted for the first time in its history into 38 luxury condominiums. The story begins in 1901, when the Fuller Construction Company acquired a piece of land at the intersection of 5th Avenue Broadway and East 23rd Street, where the 2 great avenues of Manhattan cross at an oblique angle and create a triangle. The plot was a sharp wedge of land narrowing to a point at the north end that was barely 6.5 feet wide. By every conventional real estate standard, the lot was unbuildable. A rectangular building on a triangular site would waste enormous amounts of frontage, and a building that conformed to the triangle would have to be designed from scratch. Most developers walked away from triangular Manhattan lots. The Fuller Construction Company did not. They hired the most celebrated architect in America at the time, a man named Daniel Burnham, who had directed the design of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and who was, by every account of his career, not interested in small ideas. Burnham looked at the triangle, decided to embrace it, and designed a 22-story building, 285 feet tall, that matched the shape of the lot exactly. Every floor would be a triangle. The structure would taper down to the legendary sharp point at the north end where 5th Avenue and Broadway converge. The press called it Burnham's Folly. Critics openly predicted the wind off the East River and the avenues would knock the building over before the decade was finished. New Yorkers placed informal bets on how long it would last. One newspaper in print described it as a slice of pie someone had forgotten to eat. The bets were not unreasonable on the face of it. A 22-story tower on a 6-foot-wide prow in a city where super-tall residential construction was still half a century away, in an era when most New York buildings were still being held up by their own masonry walls, sounded like an obviously bad idea. What the critics did not understand, and what nobody outside Burnham's office in Chicago really understood, was that the Flatiron was not going to be held up by masonry. It was going to be held up by something else. I want to ask you something here because I think it is genuinely worth thinking about. If every expert around you said your project was going to fail, and you were the one who had to live or die by the decision, would you trust the experts or trust the engineering? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. The reason I ask is that the building we are about to walk through is the answer Burnham gave to that question, and the answer, looking back from 124 years away, was that the engineering was right and the experts were wrong. But it took some time for that to become obvious. The building Burnham actually built used a steel skeleton frame, an internal cage of riveted steel beams that carried the structural load of every floor. The limestone and terracotta facade you see from Madison Square Park, the gargoyles and the medallions and the elaborate Renaissance revival detailing are not load-bearing. They are a skin hanging on the steel skeleton underneath. This was one of the earliest large-scale applications of skeleton frame construction in New York City. The home insurance building in Chicago, designed by William LeBaron Jenney in 1885, had pioneered the technique. By the time Burnham was designing the Flatiron, the method had been refined, but it was still novel enough that critics did not trust it. Burnham did. And the second decision he made, the one that mattered more than the steel skeleton in the long run, was that he would not stop the foundation at the surface. He would drive it down to Manhattan's schist, the ancient metamorphic bedrock that lies beneath the island, and that is the geological reason Manhattan can carry skyscrapers in the first place. The foundation of the Flatiron is anchored into rock that is hundreds of millions of years old. The building is, in the most literal sense, attached to the same geological feature that the entire skyline now stands on. Construction took 1 year. The building was completed in 1902. The wind problem the critics had warned about turned out to be real in a way, but not in the way they had predicted. The narrow prow of the building, where the two avenues converge, did create unusual wind patterns at street level. Air flowing down both Fifth Avenue and Broadway met at the building's point and produced downdrafts that swirled around the base. In the early years of the 20th century, this had a peculiar social consequence. Women walking past the building had their long skirts lifted by the swirling wind, and crowds of men began gathering on 23rd Street to watch. The New York City police, faced with this novel form of public disorder, began clearing the loiterers off the corner with a brusque shout that, according to one popular etymology of the phrase, became American slang. The men were told 23 skidoo. The number was the street. The word was the order to leave. Whether that is the true origin of the phrase is still debated. What is not debated is that the prow of the Flatiron Building, almost from the day it opened, was understood to do something to the wind that no previous tall building in Manhattan had done. It was officially called the Fuller Building, after the company that had commissioned it. New Yorkers ignored that name almost immediately because what the building actually looked like, from any angle on Fifth Avenue, was the iron. Not a modern garment steamer, not an electric iron, specifically a cast iron flat iron, the heavy solid metal block, sometimes called a sad iron, that women in the late 19th century heated on a wood-burning stove and then carried with a thick cloth wrapped around the handle to press the wrinkles out of clothes. The base of those irons was a perfect elongated triangle, sharp at the front, wide at the back, exactly the shape of the building. The nickname stuck within months of completion. By 1903, when the photographer Alfred Stieglitz captured the building rising out of a snowy, misty Madison Square morning, the photograph was published in his journal, Camera Work, under the building's nickname, not its official one. Edward Hopper painted it. Generations of American artists used it as a subject. By the middle of the 20th century, the Flatiron Building had become one of the most reproduced architectural images in the world. It was on postcards in tourist shops in Tokyo and Buenos Aires before most New Yorkers had ever set foot inside it. In 1966, the city of New York designated it a landmark. In 1989, the federal government named it a National Historic Landmark. The building that had been called Burnham's Folly was now federally protected. For most of the 20th century, the Flatiron functioned as a commercial office building, housing a rotating roster of publishing houses, advertising agencies, and creative firms that valued having the most photographed business address in Manhattan. The long-term anchor tenant was Macmillan Publishers, one of the largest book publishers in the world. Macmillan's history, incidentally, is one of the strangest in modern publishing. The company was acquired in 1988 by the British media baron Robert Maxwell, the same Maxwell whose Maxwell Communication Corporation collapsed spectacularly in 1991 after his death at sea and the discovery that he had been looting his own pension funds. Macmillan was eventually sold to the German publisher Holtzbrinck. Through all of those corporate convulsions, the Macmillan offices at the Flatiron Building stayed open, and the building's identity in New York publishing remained intact. Until 2019, when Macmillan finally packed up and left, citing the cost of modernizing the building's infrastructure to support a contemporary publishing operation. And here is where the story stops being triumphant and starts being painful. In 2019, the Flatiron Building was owned by a group of stakeholders that included GFP Real Estate, the Italian-based Sorgente Group, ABS, real estate partners, and a minority holder named Nathan Silverstein. GFP and Sorgente wanted to convert the building into luxury residential condominiums and brought in a development partnership to make that happen. Silverstein refused to agree to the conversion. The lawsuit started. The years passed. The building sat dark and empty on one of the most valuable commercial corners in the city. And eventually, a New York State court, faced with stakeholders who would not agree on what to do with a 124-year-old national historic landmark, issued an order that nobody in the group had wanted. The Flatiron Building would be sold at public auction. A judge would let the market decide what the parties could not. The first auction was scheduled for March 2023. And what happened at it, in my honest assessment, is one of the strangest auction stories in modern American real estate. If you have made it this far, here's the second question I want you to think about as we walk through what happened. When you participate in an auction for a building worth more than $100 million, what should the auction house require you to prove in advance that you can actually pay? Hold your answer. The auction rules at the Flatiron sale required something specifically less than what you are probably thinking, and the consequences of that gap are the entire story of what happened next. The first auction proceeded normally. The majority stakeholders, GFP and Sorgente, bid aggressively, hoping to consolidate ownership. The bids climbed past $150 million. And then a man stepped forward who almost nobody in the room recognized, a man named Jacob Garlick, who later described himself to the New York Post as a Virginia-based developer. He bid $190 million. The room went quiet. The auctioneer waited. Nobody else bid. Garlick had won the Flatiron Building. Under the auction's stated terms, he had 10 business days to wire a deposit of $19 million, 10% of the bid price, to confirm the sale. The deposit never arrived. What followed in the days after the auction read more like a screenplay than a real estate transaction. Garlick's attorneys made repeated public assurances that the money was coming. They blamed two separate banks for failed wire transfers, first Truist, then PNC. They submitted partial financial documentation to the building's owners that included a bank statement showing a balance of $12 million and a list of real estate holdings in Aspen and Napa. The owner's attorneys looked at the documents and pointed out that the names on the bank account had been redacted and the property ownership records had not been verified. Garlick gave one interview to the New York Post during this period in which he described owning the Flatiron Building as having been his dream since the age of 14. The deposit still did not arrive. The 10-day window closed. The sale collapsed. And then the conspiracy theory began. Jeff Gurl, one of the building's former minority co-owners and a longtime fixture in New York real estate, told the New York Post that he believed Garlick may have been related to Nathan Silverstein, the minority holdout whose refusal to agree to the conversion had triggered the forced auction in the first place. The theory, in Gurl's framing, was that Garlick had bid up the price specifically to punish the majority stakeholders who would now have to absorb either a much higher purchase price or the expense of running the auction a second time. Silverstein never publicly responded to the allegation. Garlick's lawyers denied it. The court eventually banned Garlick from participating in the second auction. The owner's subsequent civil lawsuit against Garlick and his entity Abraham Trust, alleging that the bid had been fraudulent, remains in litigation. He has never publicly explained what happened. The second auction was held in May of 2023. The majority stakeholders, GFP and Sorgente, won the building back for $161 million, approximately $29 million less than Garlick's phantom bid. They now control the property, and the conversion of the Flatiron Building into 38 luxury residential units under a development partnership with the Brodsky Organization is now underway. The construction loan is reported at $357 million. Unit prices have been reported across a wide range from approximately $2 million at the smallest configurations to as much as $50 million for the penthouse on the 21st floor. The work includes the replacement of more than 1,000 windows, the restoration of thousands of terracotta fixtures, and the repair of the 6-foot-tall cornice that has been crumbling for decades. The Landmarks Preservation Commission has approved an LED lighting scheme that will illuminate the building at night for the first time in its history. I personally think the most striking detail in this entire story is the one the financial coverage usually skips. The Flatiron Building, during the depths of the Great Depression in the 1930s, reportedly changed hands for $100,000 for a national landmark that would later be valued at more than $200 million. The building has lived through every cycle the American economy has been able to throw at it. It has been celebrated, ignored, rediscovered, photographed by every tourist with a camera, painted by every Edward Hopper of every generation, threatened by phantom bidders, and protected by historic landmark designations from both the city and the federal government. It has sat empty. It has sat full. And it has not, in 124 years, settled into the ground. I want to bring this back to the files argument because I think this is the part that matters. Almost every other building this channel has investigated is a story of what happens when the foundation is wrong. The Flatiron is the counterexample. Burnham anchored it to schist bedrock in 1902 with Victorian-era engineering on a Victorian-era budget. 122 years later, at 161 Maiden Lane in the financial district, a developer chose to save approximately $6 million by using a soil improvement foundation instead of driving piles to bedrock. The building started leaning before construction was finished. It is now bent, abandoned, and may have to be demolished. The decision Burnham made in 1902 on a triangular sliver of land everyone said could not support a tower has held for 124 years. The decision the developer made at 161 Maiden Lane held for less than 3. The gap between those two decisions is the entire history of how American real estate forgets every generation what the previous generation already learned. This is document number 9. This is what is in the file. I asked you near the beginning whether you would trust the experts or the engineering, and I asked you what an auction house should require a bidder to prove. Now, knowing what you know about Burnham's bedrock foundation and Jacob Garlick's phantom bid, here's the question I really want from you. If you had $200 million to spend on a single piece of New York City real estate, would you buy a unit in the new Flatiron condominium conversion when it opens, knowing that the building has stood for 124 years and is anchored to bedrock? Or would you put your money in one of the brand new pencil towers on Billionaires Row, 2 miles north of it, where the engineering decisions are still being argued about in court? Tell me where you land. I read them all. Every collapse has a cost. Every cost has a record. We open the file.